The tension reportedly began with a moment nobody expected to become a royal family storm. What happened next allegedly brought Carole Middleton into the middle of a bitter dispute.
The tension reportedly began with a moment nobody inside the palace expected to become a full-blown family war. What happened next allegedly pulled a quiet, unassuming grandmother named Margaret Ashworth into the middle of a bitter standoff with the most powerful woman in the kingdom of Aldenmark, Queen Isolde herself. According to the whispers now spreading through royal circles, Margaret was done staying silent. She believed her granddaughter had been humiliated, and she was not going to let a crown stop her from saying so. Behind the palace's polished ceremony and perfect photographs, insiders say the atmosphere turned ice cold. So what actually happened between these two families? And why did a woman with no title, no staff, and no official standing decide this was the day she'd finally push back against a queen? Stick around, because the first chapter reveals exactly what lit the fuse. Chapter 1. The grandmother who refused to disappear, Margaret Ashworth, was never meant to be a household name. She wasn't born into the aristocracy. She never trained for court life, and she certainly never expected to spend her 60s learning the difference between a curtsy and a bow. She was, by every measure that mattered to her, simply a mother, and then, when her daughter Clara married Crown Prince Edmund, she became something else entirely. A grandmother standing just outside the gates of one of the most scrutinized families in the world. That position mattered more than anyone anticipated, because Clara and Edmund's middle child, 7-year-old Princess Wilhelmina, known to everyone who loved her simply as Mina, was not an ordinary child. She was third in line to the Aldenmark throne, which meant that even her scraped knees and her missing baby teeth were treated, in certain rooms of the palace, as matters of state. Margaret had watched Mina grow from a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket into a small, serious girl who liked to hum while she colored, and who hated wearing shoes that pinched. She had watched all of this the way any grandmother would, with pride, with worry, and with the quiet understanding that she had no real power to protect any of it if the palace machinery ever decided to close its doors to her. That is exactly why the rumors now spreading about an alleged confrontation between Margaret and Queen Isolde have caught fire the way they have. The story making the rounds describes a moment when Isolde was said to have crossed a line publicly, sharply, and in front of witnesses regarding Mina's behavior at a royal engagement. And in the version of events now circulating, Margaret didn't stay in the background where grandmothers of her kind are typically expected to remain. She stepped forward. But before going any further, it's worth pausing on something important. No one outside a small circle actually knows, with certainty, what was said in that room, or whether the confrontation played out anything like the dramatic retelling suggests. What we do know is that the story has struck a nerve, and that nerve says something revealing about how people understand power inside a modern monarchy. Queen Isolde holds the formal crown. Margaret holds nothing but a family photograph and a lifetime of school pickups. And yet, according to the people now buzzing about this story, it was Margaret's voice that reportedly refused to be quieted. So what does that contrast really tell us? Perhaps it's not simply a story about two women disagreeing. Perhaps it's a story about who the public believes should have the final say over a child's protection, the institution, or the family standing quietly behind it. Why has a 7-year-old girl who has barely started school become the emotional center of a royal power struggle? What exactly is said to have happened at that engagement? And could the next chapter reveal a family divide that the palace has been desperate to keep behind closed doors? Let's find out. Mina has never known a version of her life that wasn't observed. From the moment the palace released her first official photograph, she became public property in a way no child should have to reckon with. Every year of her life since has added a new layer of scrutiny. Her first steps, her first day of school, the way she waves at cameras she barely understands are watching her. That would be complicated enough for any child. But Mina's situation carries an additional weight because she is not simply a young royal attending the occasional garden party. She is third in line to the Aldenmark throne, positioned behind only her father and her older brother. That means decisions about her schooling, her security, her public appearances, and even her friendships are treated, in certain palace departments, as matters that touch the future of the institution itself. Prince Edmund and Princess Clara have tried, by most accounts, to build a wall of normalcy around their children in the middle of all this. Insiders describe a household where mealtimes are ordinary, where the children are expected to tidy their own rooms, and where royal duty is something introduced gradually, rather than imposed, all at once. Mina, in particular, seems to occupy a strange middle ground, young enough to still need the ordinary protections given to any child, and yet positioned close enough to the throne that her behavior is already being discussed as though it reflects on the monarchy's future. That tension is precisely why a story suggesting Mina was humiliated or harshly criticized by a senior royal generates such an intense reaction. It isn't simply a disagreement between grown women. It becomes, in the public imagination, a question about whether a child is being protected or whether she is being treated as a symbol before she's even old enough to understand what that means. The circulating account describes Margaret as unwilling to let that treatment pass without a response. But once again, it's worth separating the emotional core of the story from its unconfirmed details. What we can examine is the underlying tension it reveals. Margaret has no formal authority inside the palace. Her connection to Mina exists entirely through family, through love, through the ordinary bond of a grandmother and granddaughter. That kind of connection doesn't show up on any official chart of royal precedence, but it may carry more emotional weight than any title ever could. There's another layer worth sitting with here too. The intensity of public reaction to this story may say less about Isolde and Margaret specifically, and more about what the public expects from the people surrounding a future monarch. Mina represents the next generation. Edmund and Clara are raising her under conditions almost no other parents on Earth have to navigate. If criticism of Mina is felt as criticism of the entire Wales equivalent household, then Margaret's instinct to step in becomes part of something much larger than a private spat. So the real question isn't only whether one alleged confrontation took place. It's this: why has a little girl's treatment become a stand-in for a much bigger argument about family loyalty, royal expectation? And who actually gets to decide what's best for a child born into a role she never asked for? Where does a grandmother's devotion end, and where does the machinery of the crown begin? And when those two forces collide, whose judgment does Clara Mina's own mother ultimately trust more? Keep watching to understand why this story has taken hold so powerfully. It helps to strip away the palace gates entirely and look at who Margaret Ashworth actually is. She is Clara's mother. She is the woman who packed school lunches, who sat through recitals and folding chairs, who was there long before anyone in Aldenmark knew her daughter's name would one day be spoken alongside a crown prince's. That history matters enormously. Margaret's bond with Clara, and by extension with Mina and her siblings, was built over decades of ordinary family life, long before palace protocol ever entered the picture. She didn't marry into royal duty. She watched her daughter marry into it, and she has spent every year since figuring out how to remain close to her grandchildren inside a world that operates by rules she never asked to learn. That is a fundamentally different kind of relationship than the one Isolde holds with the family. Isolde's position comes through marriage to the reigning king, a formal, ceremonial, constitutionally recognized role. Margaret's position comes through nothing but blood and love, the kind of bond that exists in every family, royal or otherwise, without needing a title to validate it. That contrast becomes especially sharp when a controversy involving Mina places these two women on opposite sides of an alleged confrontation. Isolde holds the formal rank of queen. Margaret holds no rank at all. On paper, there's no contest. But formal rank has never been the only kind of power that matters inside a family, and that may be exactly why this story has resonated the way it has. A queen can command ceremonial respect. A grandmother can command something else entirely: trust, comfort, the sense of being genuinely known rather than merely observed. That doesn't mean Margaret has any real authority over how the monarchy conducts itself. It doesn't mean she could override a royal decision even if she wanted to. But it may explain why so many people, watching this story unfold from the outside, find themselves rooting for the woman without the crown. If the situation is really about protecting Mina, then the confrontation, whether it happened exactly as described or not, represents something bigger than two women clashing. It represents two entirely different sources of influence meeting head-on, one built on institution and one built on intimacy. And that raises the next question hanging over this entire story. When those two worlds collide over a child's well-being, which one is supposed to win? What happens when the family closest to a child disagrees with the institution meant to shape her future? Could one disagreement expose a divide that's been quietly building for years? Stay with us. Before Clara married into the royal family, the Ashworths existed entirely outside the machinery of the monarchy. Margaret's life revolved around raising her children, managing an ordinary household, and navigating the everyday concerns that have nothing to do with succession or ceremony. There was no security detail. There were no engagements to plan around. There was just family. Everything shifted the moment Clara became Princess Clara. Margaret didn't just gain a royal son-in-law, she gained an entirely new set of expectations she had never trained for. Suddenly, the grandmother of children who would one day matter to the future of Aldenmark was expected to understand protocol she'd never studied and navigate a world built on rules she had no say in writing. That contrast between the world Margaret came from and the world she was thrust into is part of what makes this story land so hard with audiences. One side of this alleged clash represents tradition, ceremony, decades of institutional expectation. The other represents something far more ordinary, the instinct of a parent, or in this case, a grandparent, to protect a child from pressure that feels unfair or excessive. Isolde's experience inside the royal world couldn't be more different from Margaret's. She has spent years absorbing the unwritten rules of palace life, how to carry herself at a state dinner, how to manage the expectations placed on every word she says in public. As queen, she represents an institution where appearance, tradition, and precedent often carry enormous weight. That doesn't prove she mistreated Mina. It doesn't confirm that the alleged confrontation happened the way the story describes, but it does help explain why any suggestion of tension between Isolde and the younger royals ignites such a strong reaction. Underneath the specific allegation is a bigger, more uncomfortable question. What should a child born into this kind of position actually be expected to endure? Should young royals be trained from the earliest possible age to meet every traditional expectation without exception? Or should their parents and grandparents be given room to build something softer, more protected, around them? Neither answer proves wrongdoing on its own. Reasonable people build different homes with different values. And disagreements about how to raise a child don't automatically make one side the villain. But when those disagreements touch a girl as publicly significant as Mina, the stakes feel larger than an ordinary family disagreement because so much of the public has already decided she belongs, in some sense, to all of them. This is where the story stops being simple. It isn't really Margaret versus Isolde. It's two entirely different philosophies of raising the next generation, colliding in the one place neither of them fully controls a little girl's childhood. Does Isolde's formal position give her real authority over how Mina is raised? Or is the public simply projecting institutional weight onto a woman who, in truth, has no more say over Mina's upbringing than any other extended family member? And when the next detail of this story surfaces, will it reveal genuine hostility or something far messier and more human hiding underneath the headlines? Stay close. It's easy, from the outside, to flatten Isolde into a villain. But her position inside this story is far more complicated than the dramatic headlines suggest. Her path from Duchess to Queen placed her at the very center of Aldenmark's royal life, inside an institution built on hierarchy, tradition, and constant public evaluation. That position gives her visibility most people will never experience. It does not, however, give her automatic authority over every relationship inside the extended royal family, especially not over the children belonging to Edmund and Clara. That distinction becomes critical the moment Mina enters the conversation. She isn't simply another young member of an enormous extended family. as a future link in the line of succession. She represents part of the monarchy's continuity, but she is still, first and foremost, a child whose immediate parents are Edmund and Clara. They are the ones responsible for her upbringing, her privacy, and the pace at which she's introduced to public life. Isolde's role as queen exists alongside that responsibility, not above it. This is exactly where an alleged conflict becomes so sensitive. A claim that Isolde was harsh or dismissive toward Mina creates an emotionally charged narrative almost instantly. But the dramatic confrontation now circulating in whispered detail has not been confirmed by anyone with direct knowledge of the events. Treating every detail as settled fact would be a mistake, because a story involving a queen and a future monarch can spiral into something far bigger than a private disagreement almost overnight. Criticism of Mina can easily be read as criticism of her parents. A protective response from Margaret can just as easily be read as a challenge to Isolde's authority. Before long, everyone involved appears to be standing on opposite sides of a battle for the monarchy's soul, even if what actually happened was something far smaller, far more human, and far less dramatic than the story suggests. Isolde's decades inside royal life mean she's closely associated with the institution's traditions and unwritten expectations. But being queen does not make her Mina's parent. Her title doesn't erase the boundaries that Edmund and Clara are entitled to set around their own children. That's the real tension sitting at the heart of this story. Isolde represents one side of the institution, while Edmund, Clara, and Margaret represent the family circle standing protectively around its next generation. Whether the alleged confrontation was real, exaggerated, or reshaped entirely by rumor and retelling, the reaction to it reveals something worth noticing: how quickly a story about a child can transform into a story about who really holds power inside a modern monarchy, who ultimately decides where the boundaries around Mina's future should sit. What happens when quiet, private protection becomes impossible to keep quiet any longer? And when royal duty and family loyalty pull in opposite directions, does the truth come out gently, or does it force a confrontation nobody inside that palace was prepared for? Stay tuned. If Margaret Ashworth ever truly influences how this story ends, it won't be because of any title. It will be because of something far quieter: her place inside the small circle of people Mina trusts completely. Unlike Isolde, Margaret holds no formal position within the monarchy. She can't issue instructions to palace staff. She can't set official policy. She has no seat at any council table. And yet, as Clara's mother and Mina's grandmother, she occupies a role that no institutional title could ever replace. That distinction becomes especially important once the alleged confrontation is examined more carefully. The circulating account suggests Margaret responded forcefully after Isolde was said to have treated Mina harshly during that engagement, but the details of that exchange, including exactly what was said and by whom, remain unconfirmed by anyone outside the small group present. What can be examined instead is the principles sitting underneath the rumor. Edmund and Clara are Mina's parents. They are the ones who ultimately decide the boundaries around their children's lives, not simply their public duties, but the everyday protections that come with raising a child under extraordinary scrutiny. Margaret can support those decisions without ever needing to become an official part of the royal institution herself, and that makes her potential influence very different from Isolde's. A public confrontation creates spectacle and headlines. Quiet, consistent boundaries set firmly by parents who love their child tend to have a far more lasting effect. If Edmund and Clara ever concluded that a particular situation was genuinely harmful to Mina, they wouldn't need Margaret to fight anyone on their behalf. They could simply decide, quietly and privately, what access and involvement felt appropriate going forward. That is the deeper, less dramatic truth sitting underneath a story that has been dressed up as an all-out family war. The real question was never whether Margaret could outpower Isolde. She couldn't, and she likely never wanted to try. Her potential strength lies somewhere else entirely, in standing beside Clara, supporting Edmund's decisions, and remaining a steady, trusted presence in Mina's private life without ever needing to challenge the monarchy itself. That reframes what protection actually looks like in a story like this one. It doesn't require public humiliation or a dramatic showdown at a state dinner. Sometimes it just means quietly deciding, as a family, what's best for a child and holding that line without needing anyone's permission. 3 very different forms of influence now sit side by side in this story. Which one, in the end, actually shapes Mina's future, the crown, the institution, or the family that raised her? Keep watching. Every thread of this story eventually leads back to the same place, Mina herself. She is the reason any of this matters at all. Third in line to the throne, and still just a little girl who hums while she colors and hates shoes that pinch. That combination enormous future significance, paired with an entirely ordinary childhood, is what makes her position so delicate, and what makes any story suggesting she was mistreated land with such force. Margaret's place in all of this remains unusual by design. She holds no title, no constitutional authority, no official role within the institution her granddaughter is destined to help carry forward. Her importance comes entirely through Clara, and through the ordinary, everyday closeness of a grandmother who has been present for nearly every stage of Mina's short life. That makes her influence fundamentally different from Isolde's. Isolde carries the formal weight of the crown. Margaret carries something the crown can't manufacture: decades of unconditional presence. Edmund and Clara remain the ones actually responsible for deciding how their children are raised and protected, regardless of the wider obligations the monarchy places on their shoulders. That responsibility is where the real story lives, not in a single dramatic confrontation, real or imagined, but in the quiet, ongoing choices two parents make every day about how much of the institution their daughter is exposed to, and how much of her childhood remains simply hers. The alleged clash between Margaret and Isolde captures attention because it stages two very different kinds of power against each other: royal hierarchy on one side, family loyalty on the other. But neither one has to defeat the other for this story to matter. Mina's future will likely be shaped by both, in proportions no headline can fully capture. So the question this story ultimately leaves behind isn't really about who won an argument that may never have happened exactly as described. It's about something quieter and more enduring. Will Oldenmark's monarchy, generations from now, be remembered for its ceremony and hierarchy, or for the private values of the ordinary people who loved its future queen before the world ever learned her name? What do you think? Should a grandmother ever challenge a queen to protect a child? Or does loyalty to the family sometimes have to know its limits? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more royal-inspired drama.